Hello and welcome to the Stonebridge Press podcast. I'm your host, Peter Goodman. I'm in Berkeley, California. And here with me again today is Michael Palmer in New York.
Yeah, hello.
Stonebridge Press, as you may know, is a book publisher. We have books on a variety of Asia-related subjects. But if you're interested in finding out more about Stonebridge, please go to www.stonebridge.com. And these days, you can also find us on Substack and on Twitter and also on Facebook. Today's guest is David Joiner. David Joiner is a novelist. He was born and raised in Cincinnati, and he now makes his home in Japan, specifically in the western Japanese city of Kanazawa, which is also the locale of his most recent book, Kanazawa, which Stonebridge published in January last year, about a year ago, and also of his forthcoming book called The Heron Catchers, which will be available this coming fall season. Now, David has been doing some promotional activities in connection with Kanazawa. There's a Books on Asia podcast, and he also did a long presentation at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan in December of 2021. That's just last month, with Robert Whiting, who is also another Stonebridge author. And in both those podcasts, he talks quite a bit about Kanazawa, the book recently published. So if you'd like to hear more about that, specifically about Kanazawa and other takes that David has had on writing, please check out those two videos online. Today, I'd really like to talk with David more about being a writer in Japan, but I do want to give him the opportunity to tell us a little bit about Kanazawa, which was published last year, and also about The Heron Catchers, which is coming out this year. So welcome, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. Well, Kanazawa is the first literary novel written in English that's set in the city of Kanazawa. It is about an American man who's married to a Japanese woman, and they live together with her family in Kanazawa. And he and his wife have had in mind buying an old traditional Japanese home to live in and to start their own family. And the point where they're right about to sign a lease, his wife suddenly gets cold feet and decides that she is not going to go along with the plan. And so from that moment forward, a real conflict arises. And at the same time, her parents are dealing with a sort of mystery that has come up from 30 years before. And it involves Mirai in a way that she's not aware of, a secret from the past. I don't know if that is a decent summary of the novel.
Well, let's say, if you want to know more, please read the book. Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the subtext of the novel might be the kind of conflict between tradition and modern, which I guess is a kind of a standard trope in writing about Japan these days. And it's played out a little bit ironically, in the sense that it's the foreigner husband who is kind of more enamored of the traditional side of Japan, and it's the Japanese wife who's more interested in pursuing a more modern environment.
Yes, that's much better said. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of an interesting thing. Now, and that takes place in Kanazawa, and a lot of the people who read the book and remarked upon it have talked about the amazing sense of place that you were able to create. The action takes place there, and you describe people walking on the streets and what they see, the buildings that are there, and of course, the presence of Izumi Kyoka, the novelist, who is sort of Kanazawa's favorite son, who's got statues and like plaques all over the place. Now, The Heron Catchers is partly takes place in Kanazawa, but it also takes place outside.
As you said, it takes place partly in Kanazawa, but mostly in south of Kanazawa, about an hour away, in a town called Yamanaka Onsen, where my wife and I actually bought an old akiya, an old abandoned house there, and had it renovated. So I've gotten to know that town pretty well. And I wanted to set something there as well. The Heron Catchers, I started that book the day that I finished Kanazawa. And 23 days later, I'd finished a draft of it, 78,000 words. I'd just written a chapter a day. I don't think I'll ever be able to do that again.
That is phenomenal.
Were you in a hallucinatory feverish state when you were doing that?
You would think I must have been, but no, it just poured out of me. And I don't know where it came from. But by the end, it took me about a full year to revise it to the point that I was more or less satisfied. So it's about an American man named Sedge who's living in Kanazawa with his wife, Nozomi. And Nozomi suddenly leaves him for another man who's a famous kutani maker. And Nozomi's brother, who runs a ryokan, a traditional Japanese in Yamanaka onsen, feels terrible about what she's done. And he gives Sedge a lifeline by giving him a room in the ryokan. And while he's there, he gets to know the wife of the man that Nozomi runs off with. Her name is Mariko, and she is living with the son of her absent husband. His name is Riku. And so the story really kind of comes to center on the relationship that begins to develop between Sedge and Mariko, and then between Sedge and Riku, the 16-year-old son, who's quite troubled, it turns out.
Well, one of the things about both books that was very striking for someone like me who's read a lot of novels, say, written by non-Japanese writers that take place in Japan. You're writing from the perspective of a non-Japanese person in Japan, but your protagonist, the fact that they're foreign is not a big issue. And you reflect on that in your talk in December with Bob Whiting. That's not the center point or the place where the action of the novel derives from. And so when they speak, the reader assumes, well, they're speaking very high level, natural Japanese, and no one once ever comes up to them and says, Nihongo wa jouzu desu ne. And that never happened, which I'm sure you get that all the time.
Uh-huh.
In other words, the foreigner in your book is not the other, stumbling, making mistakes, feeling superior, feeling isolated. Your protagonists are extremely well integrated,
right,
and they seem to understand the cultural signals. Do you find that to be true in your own life? Have you been there so long that you actually feel comfortable and you don't feel reminded every day that you are a foreigner and different?
I'm reminded of that every day here. My existence, my level of integration is not the same as the characters that I write about. It was true of my first book, Lotus Land, too, which is set in Vietnam. I like to have my characters be integrated. It's easier to write about them. It's easier to place them on sort of an equal. I think it's important for me to have my characters sort of on an equal footing, linguistically, and even in some respects, culturally. I don't want their foreignness in the novel to be front and center all the time. I don't want that to be the source of conflicts, particularly even of any misunderstandings that happen, although I think that's inevitable. And I think that allows me to go a lot deeper in their interactions with each other. There's not a ceiling at which, I have to limit them.
But it is so different from so many other treatments that you get from other writers. In a sense, you're kind of giving up where you could develop a story because, these differences between, say, foreign and Japanese, they're the stuff of comedy and drama and, all sorts of things.
Right.
And you sort of said, no, I don't want those easy things. I want to go deeper into sort of more universal human relationships,
right,
and to present them in a way that can only be understood by an intimate understanding when you have kind of landscape and culture meshed into one universe.
Right. I would rather try to write a book similar to the books that I read, where you don't have foreigners necessarily front and center, where the conflict is centered around their foreignness. It's just people living normal lives and not having to focus on the cultural differences that they have.
Someone at the Correspondence Club, I think, read a quote from one of the reviewers who said that the book reminded them of an Ozu movie. You were very flattered by that comparison. And I think you said also that was one of your intentions, not to write an Ozu movie per se, but to sort of have a Japanese sensibility to the book, I guess, to the prose and to the way it developed. As a publisher, that's certainly what I responded to. We published a collection of short stories by a Japanese writer named Shono Junzo. To my mind, had the very, very same qualities. And I have an idea of what that might be, but when you think of like trying to develop a Japanese sensibility in your own writing, how do you describe that? And is it something that kind of comes to you naturally, or do you feel that you have to do it in a way that's more deliberate?
I think it's difficult to describe exactly what that sensibility is. I think it really just comes from a confidence that I have that all the reading that I've done, and it's just sort of my own development as a writer, that in my writing, the story will reflect what I've read. When I was a bit younger, I used to write out on my own computer, Kawabata especially. For whatever reason, I'm really attracted to the books that he's written. So I've written out on my own computer the full novels, Snow Country, Thousand Cranes. I've written out part of Sound of the Mountain. And that was an exercise to try to learn the sentence structures and the rhythms of those books. And of course, those are translated by Edward Seidensticker. So in a way, I was kind of studying his writing. I wasn't trying to copy those books, but I thought I could learn something by writing them out. And then once I had them written out on my book, I could copy and paste things and put them side by side and kind of study them. And I think that too has had an effect on the way that I write.
Well, something happened, when you first sent me Kanazawa to read, I read the very first opening scene, and, there's this thing where he's looking outside and he sees the lights, and then he sees also a reflection in the glass.
Yeah.
And, there's that very famous scene in Snow Country where they're going through the tunnel, and he sees the reflection of himself in the glass before they emerge from the tunnel. I mean, you must be very familiar with that particular scene, and I'd be surprised if it wasn't a deliberate echo on your part.
It was.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, well, it was kind of homage.
Yeah. So, yeah, and homage, and that was one of my favorite scenes of all time. And so I kind of got that right away. And that is definitely one reason that I was very hooked on that story from the very beginning. But it wasn't just that, as an editor, kind of a line editor going through your work, I would say a lot of very, very short and simple sentences. You don't spend a lot of time inside somebody's head. You have a lot of conversations, and you have a lot of just observances of things that are kind of happening outside the frame, that are kind of constructing the temporal spatial landscape of what's happening in that particular moment. And that kind of sensitivity to surfaces, to things that are sort of on the periphery, but are nevertheless exerting some sort of gravitational force on what's happening without being very direct about it, is the thing. It's all there. It's neatly constructed. And as a reader, it just kind of washes over you and puts you in this space, I think, where you're very receptive to what's happening to the people. I think it looks easy, because you end up with simple sentences, but I don't think it's easy to do. I imagine your process must be to write a lot and then winnow it down.
I was just going to say that. Yeah, I'm starting on a new book now, and I'm about 40 or 50 pages into it. And one of the things that I recognize already, and that always kind of frustrates me, is that the writing it's not as polished as it needs to be. And I recognize that, as you said, the writing process means that I'm going to have to revise these sentences again and again and again. And at some point, I think the style of my writing will probably resemble again Kanazawa and perhaps the Heron Catchers as well. But it's a long process. The important thing in the beginning is to get the story down. And then I focus more on the language and on sentence structure and things like that.
Do you delineate the process when you're writing, in the sense that, like you said, first you just get the story down, write as much as you can, get it all out on paper, and then go back and refine it? Or are you kind of doing these things simultaneously as time goes on?
I do both, actually. As I write, I'm also revising constantly, but that's mostly kind of on a level of just story writing, getting the story out. The revision at the end is much more kind of refining things, refining the sentences and the language and things like that. I end up cutting so much by the time that a book is done. I might end up writing 100,000 words, and then the final product will only be about 70,000 words or something. So that's 100 pages, 30,000 words that I've cut out.
So let's talk a little bit about being a novelist in Japan, particularly a writer of English books. You're in Kanazawa, which, for those who don't know, is in Western Japan. I don't know how many kilometers it is from Tokyo or Kyoto, but it's kind of a long distance. There's mountains in the way. I guess you have the Shinkansen. You can get to a big city fairly quickly. But you are kind of cut off, I guess, from other writers. Is that by choice?
Lived and worked in the city of Fukui. Kanazawa was very close to Fukui. I could take a train here in 40 minutes. And I'd visited Kanazawa in the past as a tourist several times. And I knew I liked Kanazawa very much just for its cultural attributes. And I knew that I wanted to live here at some point. And I was fortunate enough that I was able to move here. You know, when I moved here, I just assumed I would find other writers. I have not met a single person here who writes fiction. I'm sure they're out there, but I have not met a single person here.
So there's no literary cafe scene or anything like that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Were you aware of the Izumi Kyoka connection to Kanazawa prior to moving there?
Yeah, I did. I had 2 collections of his short stories, and I'd read them before, and I'd been to the Memorial Museum here a few times before I had ever moved here. But in Kyoto, for example, or in Tokyo, you're going to find a ton of people who write and who publish. And the literary communities there are a lot more vibrant, both the foreign community and the Japanese community. In Kanazawa, I don't even really know about of any sort of Japanese writers here. A lot of successful Japanese writers who have come from Kanazawa, they almost invariably end up moving to Tokyo, which makes sense. It's the center of the publishing, universe in Japan. And in Kanazawa, I am the only person that I'm aware of who's writing novels that are set here. And I would love it, actually, if I found a community of writers. It would be nice to have a community like that where we could support each other in what we're trying to do.
When I was young, I went to Japan when I was 25, and I had all these dreams in my head of what it would be like. And I don't think I was there more than 10 days before I realized this is not like what I was thinking of it was going to be at all. But I think people hearing your interview and listening to your life and saying, wow, here's a guy, he lives in Japan, he writes novels. And, he's living the dream in a way. I mean, I think it'd be very inspiring to particularly young people who are setting out and wondering, whether they should devote themselves to literature. You really sound like it's sort of driving your whole life in a way.
In a way, I mean, this is what I want to do. And I know that I'll continue to write, for as long as I'm able to, right? So, and I do it mostly for myself, but at the end, when you finish the book, you want to have people read it. So, I write for myself, but at the end, I want to share what I've written with other people if I think it's good enough.
Do you enjoy writing? The actual process of writing?
Over the last couple of years, I think because we moved to the United States and then we almost immediately moved back, it disrupted my routine so much that I have not been able to write as regularly as I used to. My routine has just been so disrupted that it's really kind of made it less enjoyable. But I know that when I get back to that routine, I'm going to enjoy it again. And so I'm trying really hard to get back into a daily routine of writing.
Yeah.
Are you kind of up to date on what other people are writing about Japan, or if they're fiction writers, whether they're writing fiction set in Japan? Do you pay attention to that at all? Or you just
a little bit. I don't find that there's much out there that's being published anyway.
Right.
So, what little is being published, I tend to be aware of it. I just finished a book by Nick Bradley. Was it the Cat in the City? I forget the title of the book. But, his characters are almost entirely Japanese. And, I found that very interesting. I don't write from the perspective of, Japanese characters in my books.
Well, that kind of brings up that question of cultural appropriation, which we hear a lot about in the States these days. And certainly someone who is not Japanese getting into the head of a Japanese character and purportedly presenting how, a narrative from their perspective is very likely to run into extremely harsh criticism from many critics, not all. And it may have absolutely nothing to do with the quality of what they've done, but just the fact that they've attempted to do something like that. In some quarters considered extremely discourteous.
Right.
What's your take on situations like that?
I admire what writers like Nick Bradley have done, actually. I thought he did a really good job with his book. I think that you have to be very sensitive to, your portrayals of groups that you're yourself not a part of. But like you said, that's not something that I do, and that's not something I'm likely to try to do. I worry that I'm going to write something that will offend people. It's just, people talk about that. It's, as a writer, it's just something you have to face. And I'm perfectly comfortable writing about Japan from the perspective of a foreigner. And, I usually do it in a very close third person. My characters have very close relationships with Japanese people. For me, that's sufficient for me to be able to kind of explore conflicts that are developing in the story, the relationships between people, filtering them through my own experiences here in Japan. Even though the characters aren't me, I am, as the author, the person who everything is being filtered through. Back in the day, Japanese used to be extremely interested in what foreign writers had to say about Japan. Right. That's kind of how they measured their value on the world stage. And I'm talking like 40, 50 years ago. Things have obviously changed greatly since then. What is your feeling about Japan's view of itself vis-a-vis the rest of the world? Anecdotally, I understand Japanese are less outward-facing, less ambitious to travel internationally, less interested in learning English as a commercial language, or a language that would enable them to, say, perform to live abroad. Mm-hmm. Have you noticed any changes, or what do you think? Are people interested in what your opinion about Japan is? Well, I agree with you first about what you said. I do think that a lot of people are less interested now in studying abroad or in traveling abroad and studying English. And I don't watch a lot of TV, but when I do watch it, there always seem to be shows where the hosts of these shows they're using English usually as a kind of joke. They're always laughing at English, and so they don't take it very seriously. It's, the language itself is often just sort of the butt of a joke. You always see the hosts talking to foreigners and asking them, what do you think about Japan? What do you think of Japanese food? What do you think of Japanese culture, or whatever? They seem very keen to know foreigners think about their country. And I think that's true also of literature, that foreigners are writing about Japan. And I know of a handful of Japanese people who have read my book in English, and obviously, and I was very pleased to hear what they had to say about it. They seemed to think that it was a very authentic portrayal of Japan, of Japanese families, of the dynamic between my protagonist and the Japanese characters. The dialogue seemed very true to life. I was very grateful to hear that. But I think there's a great interest in knowing what the foreign community thinks of Japan. That hasn't changed, I think, in the last 50 years, probably. Yeah. That's interesting. Well, thank you very much, David. This has been really interesting. I actually got to ask you a bunch of questions that have been on my mind for quite a while. It's really interesting to hear your perspective. I've really enjoyed being your publisher, too. Thank you. I've enjoyed having you. Love your books and your writing in particular. And Heron Catchers will be out in the upcoming season. I can't remember exactly what month we've assigned to it, but it's likely to change. So just, if you're listening, check the stonebridge.com website for future details. And of course, if you want to get Kanazawa, you can get that at, just about anywhere books are sold. You can get it as a print book, you can get it as an ebook. And if you want to find out more about David, how do you do that? You have a website. I do, yeah. It's david-joiner.com. There you can find out about other books you published and perhaps future plans. Right. It's great. Well, thank you very much, David. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Yeah, thank you.